Shabbat Shalom and welcome to the Messianic Torah Observer's Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. We brought Sabbath thoughts and reflections back for purposes of providing the body of Mashiach, the body of Messiah, an opportunity to think and to reflect on the Torah readings for each week, not from a denominationalistic or sectarian perspective, mind you, but from a Yehoshua Messiah perspective and focus. And these postings are in addition to our regular The Messianic Torah Observer podcast and blog postings. So we pray, hope, and trust that these Sabbath thoughts and reflections will be a blessing to you and your families and fellowships as you seek to live righteous lives and earnestly contend for the true faith once delivered. Praise Yah. Well, today's discussion is entitled The Very Heart of True Worship, and it is a messianic discussion of the third parashah, the third Torah reading in the 3-year Torah Reading Cycle. And our discussion text for this Shabbat will be Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 through 26. I will be reading and commenting from the Robert Alter translation of Torah entitled The 5 Books of Moshe. If you're interested in getting a copy, you can simply go over to Amazon and you can find it there. That's where I got my copy. And as an aside, I will be, along with a number of mainstream extra-biblical commentaries, referencing from time to time throughout the course of our discussion certain apocryphal or ancient extra-biblical books to enhance our discussion. Now, my use of these references or resources is in no way intended to introduce any doctrinal elements to the study, because Torah in and of itself, as far as I'm concerned, stands on its own, and it does not need any outside elements to justify or explain it. My purpose, however, in referring these resources is to bring to our awareness the understanding and potential history surrounding our discussion reading. Therefore, it is up to all of us to prayerfully consider the content of this discussion, retain what the Spirit leads us to retain, and simply discard that which the Spirit leads us to reject. So I would humbly ask you to take the whole of our discussion for what it's worth and prayerfully use it to enhance your day-to-day walk with Mashiach. So with that, let's get into this. But before we do, let's open up in quick prayer here. Father, I bless your name and give you praise, glory, and honor you so justly deserve. Set apart this time together, this fellowship together, and this teaching and discussion we have before us. May it pierce our hearts, and may we draw from it that which you have for us to understand, to hear, and to enact. Check our hearts, mold our hearts, circumcise our hearts so that we may be in a place to understand that which you have for us from this reading, in all readings that we do, so that you may get the glory, the honor that you so justly deserve, that we may image you here on the earth. We love you, Father, and give you praise and look forward to the great things you have in store for us today in Yeshua. Now, in terms of a backdrop to our reading, we must consider the fact that man's fall certainly damaged the intimate relationship he had with the Creator while he was in the garden. It is unclear precisely what form that damaged relationship took after the couple was banished or exiled from the garden, or even from Jehovah's immediate presence. So let's go ahead and get into the text. Chapter 4, beginning at verse 1. We'll proceed along each verse and we'll offer some commentary as we move through each verse. Verse 1, and the human knew Eve, his woman, and she conceived and bore Cain, and she said, I have got me a man with Jehovah, Yahweh Yahuwah. So let us take note of the statement. I have got me a man with Jehovah. Now, the Robert Alter translation and commentary of this verse suggests that here we find Eve's imagining her role in creating a man in some type of a partnership with Jehovah, no doubt reflecting back to her and her husband's origins being that of Jehovah from their creation. So in essence, we would say that all creation traces itself back to Jehovah. Now, from a rabbinic standpoint, the "I have gotten a man with the help of Jehovah" is believed by some to be an expression of Eve's rejoicing over her being reconciled to her husband, Adam. Imagine that. And the thinking here is that Adam and Eve had become estranged as a result of the tragic events of the garden. And some in rabbinic Judaism contend that Adam wholly blamed Eve for the couple's banishment from the garden. That being said or so, Eve then believed that through the birth of Cain, she essentially had regained her once estranged husband. Now, as cute as this perspective may be, there's nothing in our text to prove such musings. And I call it musings because that's just what it is. Now, is this musing a possibility? I guess all things considered, it just may be. But I personally don't think so. And it really doesn't matter what I think. The text speaks for itself. We just don't get that. At least I don't get that sense from the reading of the text. I think the text is suggestive of Eve, though, celebrating the birth of her sons. She being the first woman in all of history to experience the miracle of birth. Well, one has to imagine that she would have to say something profound. I mean, it's the first two births in the history of humanity, of humankind. So she would have to say something profound. You know, when Armstrong landed on the moon back in, supposedly, so if you believe they actually landed on the moon, I'm not entirely convinced that the United States actually did that, but that's a tale and story and discussion for another day. But you know, the momentous, the monumental, the grand statement that Neil Armstrong made was one small step. What was it? Let me look it up. I don't want to misquote it. I can't believe that. Let's take a look here. One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. That's it. So we have that as the momentous statement to highlight a momentous event in human history. And so we have here Eve making such an amazing statement here. I have got me a man with Jehovah. Well, it says what it says. And so she being the first woman in all of history to experience the miracle of childbirth, well, one has to imagine she would have to say something like that. And indeed, she most certainly did. Now, according to the book of Jubilees, the ancient book of Jubilees, that extra biblical book, it says that at the time of this story, Adam and Eve had 3 children, Cain, Abel, and a daughter named Awan. So that's the situation we have there. If you want to take that with however much salt you would like to take it with, then let's let that be in the back of your mind. Let's move on to verse 2. And she, Eve, bore as well his brother Abel, and Abel became a herder of sheep, while Cain was a tiller of the soil. Now, Abel in Hebrew means a breath, according to a rabbinic source I consulted, J. Hertz, in his Torah Haftarah publication. And the significance of the Hebrew name here seems to play upon the brief, premature, flash in the pan, if you will, life, which will be that of Abel. His life so prematurely snuffed out and ended at the hands of his brother Cain, which we will see as we get deeper into our discussion reading for today. Now, some contend that Cain, being the elder son, or the older son, was trained in tilling the soil by his father. In other words, Cain learned the family business. I know, somewhat of an overstatement, but it does seem to fit the norm of ancient Hebrew family customs of the father training up the older son to do the family business. In this case, tilling the soil, agriculture, what have you. Abel, on the other hand, was given the less physically taxing task of caring for the family's livestock, and we should take this for what it's worth. Now, according to Josephus, the name Cain means possession, and Abel means sorrow. And the text notes that the Josephus text notes that Abel was a lover of righteousness, and he believed Jehovah was always with him. Abel then excelled in virtue. Well, Cain, on the other hand, is described by Josephus as being very wicked and wholly intent on getting. Again, let's take that for what it's worth, just to add some color to what we're reading here. Verse 3. Again, we're in chapter 4 of Genesis. And the Alter translation reads, "And it happened in the course of time, that Cain brought forth, or from the fruit of the soil, an offering to Jehovah." Cain brought from the fruit of the soil an offering to Jehovah. So we have here the first mention, the first documented demonstration of worship. Worship, an offering, a sacrifice, if you will. And it seems as though the brothers' offerings were that of thanksgiving, although the specifics are lacking in our text. But it would seem that this is a thanksgiving offering. Verse 4, "And Abel too had brought from the choice firstlings of his flock, and Jehovah regarded Abel and his offering." Abel's firstling of his flock and of the fat therein is suggestive of Abel rendering unto Jehovah in thanksgiving the very best of his flock, the firstling of his flock, and the fat thereof. The fat, even in this early period of history, of human history, was esteemed as the best part of the animal. And we'll see later on when we get further into the Torah rendering, where the sacrificial system was put in place, the fat was always left for father. It was because most of the sacrifices, with the exception of some of the expiacious offerings or sacrifices that weren't entirely burnt up, well, the sacrifices and the offerings were shared with the Levitical priest. But the fat, which is the choicest part of the animal, was always rendered unto Jehovah. So I find that very interesting. Now, Abba's respect unto Abel denotes that Abba, that father, accepted Abel's offering. So father accepts Abel's offering. Now, according to the ancient book of Jasher, the sons, or the brothers, Cain and Abel, well, they brought before Jehovah what the author of Jasher describes as an approximating offering. And this approximating offering comes from the fruit of their labors, of course. From Cain, it was the fruit of his tilling the soil, and from Abel, it was the fruit of his taking care of the livestock, or in this case, the shepherding of the lambs, if you will. I've not been able to ascertain, however, what exactly an approximating offering is, but it seems to be somewhat tied to the timing of the agricultural season or seasons at that time. So I guess we can surmise that the offerings Cain and Abel rendered unto Jehovah here in our focus passage were timed around the growing season, maybe spring, which would further support this thinking that these are thanksgiving offerings. It's a form of worship of thanksgiving. But the text goes on to detail that Elohim turned and inclined unto Abel's offering, and he consumed Abel's offering with a fire from heaven. Imagine that. So there is a little more color added to this event that the Genesis account does not provide. Now, again, I'll keep warning and interjecting this throughout our time here as we go through this, that when I do bring up these extra biblical commentaries or books or whatever, we take them for what they are worth. Now, they reflect, these resources reflect at least some of the thinking in Judaism at the time they were written, how they viewed what happened in these key critical passages of Torah. So it's at the very least, we get to understand how these passages were interpreted and understood. So again, take it for what it's worth. Verse 5. But he did not regard Cain and his offering, and Cain was very incensed, and his face fell. So Cain's offering is rejected by Jehovah. And J. Hertz, in his Torah Haftarah, contends the reason for Jehovah's rejection of Cain's offering was due to the evil condition of Cain's heart. Due to the evil condition of Cain's heart. And this is as opposed to his offering being that of produce or of the fruit from his tilling, which I wholeheartedly agree with. This seems evident by the context and the content of Jehovah's warning to Cain just after his rejection of his offering. We'll see that in a moment. And Cain's spirit was not right before Jehovah, and so Yah rejected his offering. So I don't necessarily go with some of the conventional wisdom that Cain's offering was rejected because he didn't offer an animal for sacrifice, but instead offered produce. That's what I grew up hearing. But I've since had a change of heart, no pun intended. I do believe this is now more an issue of Cain's, or the condition of Cain's heart, as opposed to the consistency of Cain's offering. So this being the case, what does that say to us today about our worship of Jehovah in connection to the condition of our hearts? I say it says something pretty significant, and we'll get into that in the practical halakha and closing remarks portion of this discussion. Now, according to the ancient book of Jasher, Jehovah did not turn nor incline towards Cain's offering because, quote, he being Abel had brought from the inferior, or Cain had brought from the inferior fruit of the ground before Jehovah. I keep getting Cain and Abel mixed up in my head, and I know there's a difference, but forgive me if I do interject the wrong name in the wrong place, because I don't know what's wrong with me. My mind keeps getting the two confused, but it says he, being Cain, had brought from the inferior fruit of the ground before Jehovah. That's why, end quote, that's why Cain's offering was rejected. Now, before I leave that, understanding this thinking, I want to talk about this a little more. Many people of faith have over the centuries gotten hung up on the occupations of Cain and Abel, especially as those occupations directly affected the brothers' respective offerings or worship. And it is unclear as to why Abba chose to have Moshe declare the brothers' occupations and the substance of each one's offering and worship. And the question I have is, could there have been an issue with the content or substance of Cain's offering? And I guess the answer to that is, I guess it's possible. But is that absolutely the case? At the end of the day, the issue, though, at the core of Cain's offering being rejected by Jehovah has to do with the state of Cain's heart versus that of Abel's heart. Certainly, if by chance Cain's offering or worship was rejected because he violated Yah's requirement that offerings or sacrifices be that of animals, well, the very crux of the rejection still traces back to the state of Cain's heart. For when one willfully violates the Creator's commandments and chooses to do things one's way, to do things their way, they are in possession of an uncircumcised heart. They're in possession of a will that is resistant to giving way to the will and ways of the Creator. So it still goes back regardless to the state of one's heart. And allow me to offer some apologies if you have some bleed over of outside work being done. Today being the 6th day of the secular work week is the day that virtually everybody in this neighborhood gets their yards done by landscapers. So it seems like as every 6th day that I do these recordings at somewhere, unless it's at toward the end of the day. And even then, I get the interruptions and the bleed over of men working outside in the landscaper. So please forgive me. I'm kind of speaking a little closer to the mic so as to hopefully drown out the noise. But getting back to what we're talking about, the other thing to consider here as it relates to the consistency, the makeup of each brother's offering, is the emphasis the text makes on Abel's offering consisting of the firstlings of his flock and from their choicest. That being a point of the quality of Abel's offering, which also translates into the quality of Abel's worship. Conversely, the quality of Cain's offering, and by extension, the quality of Cain's worship, is muted in the text. We don't get a sense of that, the quality being there, which in and of itself is telling. So I believe we can safely conclude that Abel's offering and his worship was superior to that of Cain's, although the superiority may have had nothing whatsoever to do with the acceptance or rejection of one or the other's offering and worship. Again, it would appear just from the forthcoming calling out of Cain, which we'll see in just a moment, by Jehovah for his negative demeanor in response to his offering being rejected. The issue at hand is the state of Cain's heart in connection with his worship of Elohim. Messianic author and teacher Tim Hake suggests that Abel's gift or offering or worship was superior to that of Cain's because Abel brought forth worship that came from a right heart. Again, another testimony to this being a heart issue. And Cain's inferior offering or worship, on the other hand, came from a faulty, maybe even corrupt heart. And Haig goes even further to suggest that Cain was simply going through the mechanical motions of worship, absent a circumcised heart, while Abel worshiped Jehovah from a sincere and thankful heart. Now, to me, this makes complete sense, since it is inconceivable or unlikely, at least in my mind, that these were the brothers' first and only offerings unto Jehovah. It seems more likely the brothers were reared in the proper method of worship, most likely by their dad, Adam, or who himself received the revelation of how we are to worship, or how they were to worship Jehovah, directly or indirectly from Jehovah. Okay, verse 6 and 7. Verse 6 reads, "And Jehovah said to Cain, Why are you incensed? And why is your face fallen?" Verse 7. "For whether you offer well, or whether you do not, at the tent flap sin crouches, and for you is its longing, but you will rule over it. Shall it not be lifted up?" According to Hertz, which is the Hertz rendering, or the JPS, I should say, the Jewish Publication Society says, instead of "Why are you incensed, and why is your face fallen? For whether you offer well, or whether you do not, at the tent flap sin crouches, and for you is its longing, but you will rule over it." The Alter translation completely leaves out any sense of shall it being either talking about his countenance be lifted up or his offering be lifted up. But the authorized versions and the JPS, or the Jewish Publication Society, denotes shall it be lifted up if you do well. And according to Hertz, it's associated with Cain's fallen countenance, his dejected, his disappointed attitude over Yah's rejection of his offering. And Jehovah immediately recognized the evil that obviously resided within Cain, or Cain's evil heart, as mentioned in the previous 2 verse of our discussion. And so Jehovah offers Cain a spiritual lifeline, so to speak, in an attempt to head off or to arrest Cain's downward spiritual spiral. For that which was brewing, or that which was at work within Cain, would only lead to sin. So we see manifested here before us another example of Jehovah's grace and Jehovah's love for his human creation. And clearly Abba could have simply left Cain to his own devices and allowed him to sink into a spiritual abyss, an evil abyss, if you will, or just terminated Cain's life. He could have done that. But Yah offered Cain a way out, as he does all humanity. This is the essence of and a foreshadow of Jehovah's plan of salvation that is based on Jehovah's grace. And Yah says to humanity, look, you are destined for destruction because of your sin. I have a solution to your impending doom, however. If you hearken unto my still small voice and receive the salvation I'm offering before it's too late, you will be saved. Now, another perspective of the phrase, shall it be lifted up, as I mentioned, is from the perspective of the it shall be lifted up being Cain's offering. In other words, if Cain did well, if he behaved as he should, then his offering would be accepted by Jehovah, or rather, his offering would be lifted up. Jehovah, though, warns Cain that his harboring whatever was at work within him, that which one text described as vexing to him, well, it threatened to rule him and lead him to sin. I have to, at this juncture of our discussion, wonder whether or not this was another test for humanity. Were the hearts of these 2 men, in particular Cain, being tested here? Now, we've discussed on this forum many times that our Elohim is a searching of the heart kind of God, as well as he tests those who would be his. And we know that Abraham is a prime example of this reality. And Abba, our Elohim, asserts this fact. Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 9 and 10. And the New American Standard Version reads, "The heart is more deceitful than all else and is desperately sick, desperately wicked," in the KJV. And so who can understand it? Verse 10. I, Jehovah, I search the heart. I test the mind, even to give to each man according to his ways, according to the results of his deeds. So was Yah searching the heart and testing the mind of Cain? According to this critical passage of Holy Writ, it most certainly was a possibility. Nevertheless, as it was in the garden with Adam and Eve, humanity was granted free will, the wherewithal to choose how they will deal with their inner struggles and temptations. In this, the temptation is because Jehovah rejected Cain's sacrifice, Cain gives in to his innate desire for vengeance or revenge. Just thoughts and reflections, my friends. Let's move on to verse 8. And Cain said to Abel, his brother, "Let us go out to the field." And when they were in the field, Cain rose against Abel, his brother, and killed him. Now, Robert Alter notes in his translation that the phrase, "let us go out to the field," is actually missing in the Masoretic text. And the Masoretic text is the Hebrew text that was passed down to us by the Masoretes, who were Palestinian Jewish scribes. And they actually operated around 1000 AD. Well, their text is the framework by which most authorized versions of our so-called Old Testament Bibles have been translated. Well, this statement, however, is apparently found in the Greek, the Syriac, and the Aramaic text, this "let us go out to the field," but not in the authorized version. So you won't see that anywhere in most of your Bibles. I checked throughout all my Bibles and I didn't find it, so I guess Alter is probably right. As we will see, however, this statement contradicts with at least one extra biblical reference of this incident. The fact that Cain lures his brother to a place that is likely remote from the family home, while the text describing the place as, quote, "the field," end quote, is indicative of the level of planning or premeditation Cain undertook. From the evidence presented in the text, Cain was determined to fully carry out this tragic, heinous act. There was no turning back, it would seem, in Cain's mind. Now, according to the ancient book of Jasher, the text denotes that Cain sought a pretext to slay him, the him being Abel, and the reason that is given is because Jehovah did not accept his offering, Cain's offering. It seems Cain's argument should have been with Jehovah as opposed with his brother, or to his brother, who had only done what he was supposed to do. It was Cain that didn't do what he was supposed to do, whatever that thing was that he was supposed to do that he didn't do. But it says that Cain sought a pretext to slay him, premeditation. Now, where did or how were or who planted that seed, that desire to seek a pretext? Where did that come from in Cain? Such that it would lead to or cause him to seek pretext to murder his brother. We're talking again premeditated murder. That's advanced planning. Evil. And it seems as though Cain had within him an iniquitous predisposition that would cause or lead him to, one, offer an inferior offering unto Jehovah, doing things his way as opposed to doing things Yah's way. And 2, jealously, and having the wherewithal to contemplate murdering his brother, assuming that is Jasher's rendering of the incident has any semblance of truth attached to it. So I ask you, would it be safe assigning Hasatan a role in this murder? In Cain's internal workup to his brother's murder? Did another agent of the enemy somehow get to Cain and ignite in him a flame of rebellion and murder? Genesis, of course, gives no such information of this, but we do know our master referred to Hasatan as what? Being a murderer from the beginning. John chapter 8, verse 44. What did master mean by a murderer from the beginning? Did Yehoshua, our master, tie Abel's murder to Hasatan? Or to the fact that because of him, Hasatan, all humanity is subject to death? Just some thoughts, just some reflections. Now, the text further, in the ancient book of Jasher, it further notes that one day Abel's flock, you'll love this, one day Abel's flock passed over a portion of Cain's freshly plowed field, causing Cain much upset, which ultimately led to Cain murdering his brother. Now, was this the pretext Cain sought after his offering was refused by Jehovah? Well, Cain and Abel engage in a verbal dispute over, in Jasher, records that Cain and Abel engage in a verbal dispute over this situation. Abel's flock crossing over his freshly plowed field. And the text goes into some detail as to the content of that argument, which I'm not going to recite here for you. Well, the verbal dispute leads to Cain's assaulting Abel, as I mentioned, but the text goes into some detail about the emotional state of Cain in that moment after he slew his brother. The text describes Cain as sorely regretting having killed his brother, such that he was, quote, sadly grieved, and he wept over him. He wept over Abel's body, and it vexed him exceedingly, end quote. Let's move on over to verse 9. And Jehovah said to Cain, "Where is Abel your brother?" And he, Cain, said, I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper? Let's look at this. Jehovah's questioning of Cain, like that of his questioning of his father Adam, is indicative not of Jehovah's ignorance as to what transpired, but likely the questioning was done to provide the human the opportunity to what? To repent, to confess, even to teshuvah. But in either case, no confession, no repentance, no teshuvah was forthcoming, was there? Absolutely none. Only misleading rancors by each offender in a feeble attempt to throw the Almighty off script, to throw the Almighty off topic, to pass the buck, if you will. Father always throws out a lifeline to humanity. Verse 10, and he, the he being Jehovah, said, "What have you done?" He talking to Cain. Listen, and this is interesting. He says to Cain, "What have you done?" Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the soil. J. Hertz, in his Torah Haftarah, points out that Jehovah describes, or he identifies, Abel to Cain no less than 6 times over 4 verses of this passage as his brother, your brother, your brother, your brother. No doubt in part to emphasize to Cain the heinous nature of his transgression. You killed your brother. He didn't throw out his name to Cain. He said he wanted to make it extremely personal. Your brother. And the personification of Abel's blood here is just fascinating to me. In that Yah declares to Cain that Abel's blood cries out from the ground unto Jehovah. And this seems to be an introduction into human understanding, the concept of vengeance. The concept of vengeance. In other words, according to Jehovah, Abel's blood cried out to him to avenge Abel's death. And so Cain is found guilty by the court of heaven of his crime, and it falls then to the creator of all to pass judgment on Cain and act as Abel's avenger in a way, as Abel's blood cries out from the ground for justice. Justice. Now, the ancient book of Jubilees describes Abel's blood to have cried from the ground up to heaven because Cain slew him. Again, this emphasis, this focus on the blood being somewhat personified, being almost its own entity, crying out to heaven. Crying out to heaven. And here's a question. Does the blood of the slain innocent even today cry up to heaven? The innocent, those who are innocently murdered for no reason at all, but because of evil, their lives are snuffed out. The unborn. The millions of unborn babies in this nation who have been killed. What is there to say about their blood? Does it cry out to heaven for vengeance? Just something to think about. Let's move on to verse 11. And so, cursed shall you be by the soil that gaped with its mouth to take your brother's blood from your hand. Verse 12. If you till the soil, it will no longer give you its strength. So a restless wanderer shall you be on the earth. Let's stop here. Here we find that Cain is, in a sense, subjected to a repeat of that which his father was condemned to, that being a life of drudgery, having to till soil that produced more thorns and thistles than produce. For no longer would the earth yield a bounty as it once did in the garden. Furthermore, there's this sense of both being indefinitely separated, both Adam and Cain being separated from Jehovah, more so Cain than Adam here, as a result of their transgression. However, Cain's exile seems more specific. He is condemned to be a wanderer. And then in verse 12, the narrator, Moshe, details, and Cain went out from Jehovah's presence. But here's a major difference between the separation from Jehovah that Adam was relegated to and the separation that Cain was relegated to. It appears that the first family retained some semblance of relationship with the Creator. No doubt anything close to what it was in the garden, but certainly their relationship with Jehovah wasn't completely severed. There was still something there. We know that the text declares Jehovah regarded Abel's offering. Now, how that regarding of Abel's offering manifested, we have no indication here from the Genesis text. We will see in at least one extra biblical source how that regarding of Abel's offering manifested. But suffice to say, if Jehovah had completely severed relationship with the first family, he would not have involved himself in Abel's offering now, would he? Furthermore, we will find mention of Cain, quote, departing from Jehovah's presence, end quote, suggestive, at least to me, that Yah was still very active in the lives of the first family before the Cain and Abel incident. And again, these are just some thoughts and reflections on this passage for us to kind of consider as we study these passages. Alter's translation highlights the irony of Cain's transgression and the punishment Cain received from Yah. The very soil that gaped with its mouth to take his brother's blood from Cain's hand would be the very instrument used by Yah to punish the tiller by trade, Cain. And to add to Cain's misery, Cain would never be at peace. He would be a wanderer throughout his lifetime, even a fugitive, which is interesting since we will find when we get to verse 17 here in our focus passage that after the birth of his son Enoch, Cain built a city that he named after his son. Now, if Cain was condemned to being a wanderer or a fugitive for an indeterminate time frame, well, his building a city, and some resources describe this city he built that he called Enoch as a fortified or a walled city, well, would naturally imply that he, Cain, at some point took up homesteading. At least to some lesser or greater extent, he was no longer a wanderer. But I did come across at least one extra biblical source that suggests that Cain settled down in the latter parts of his life and he ultimately found peace. And he built and dwelled in at least one or so cities that he ended up building. But clearly the answer to this conundrum is not to be found in our focus passage, but suffice to draw from our text that Cain's separation from Elohim led him and his posterity, his descendant, down the road to destruction. For we will find that those who departed from the presence of Jehovah devolved into lives of seemingly irredeemable evil. And of course, that makes total sense when one removes oneself from the reality of the light of Yah's Torah and his beautiful life-giving presence. Well, the only other reality one is to be exposed to is the reality of darkness, the darkness of chaos, the darkness of evil and lawlessness. Separation from Yah is the worst state of existence any human has or will ever endure. And it would seem from the confines of our text that Cain experienced that terrible reality. Unfortunately, far too many folks in this world today are experiencing not just a present-day separation from the creator of the universe, but if they don't get their act together, they're looking at eternal separation from their creator. Yet, there comes a point in those who've lived in that separated state that they're turned over to a reprobate mind, as noted by Shaul in his letter to the Messianic assemblies in Rome. For the wrath of Elohim, this is chapter 2, beginning at verse 18 in the book of Romans. For the wrath of Elohim from heaven is revealed against all the iniquity and wickedness of men who hold the truth in iniquity. Verse 19, because a knowledge of Elohim is manifest in them. For Elohim has manifested it in them. Verse 20, for from the foundations of the world, the hidden things of Elohim are seen by the mind in the things he created. even his eternal power and divinity, so that they might be without excuse. Verse 21. Because they knew Elohim and did not glory him and give thanks to him as Elohim, but became vain in their imaginings, and their unwise heart and was darkened. Verse 22. And while they thought within themselves that they were wise, they became fools. Verse 23. And they changed the glory of the incorruptible Elohim into a likeness to the image of a corruptible man, and into the likeness of birds and four-legged animals and reptiles on the earth. Verse 24, for this cause Elohim gave them up to fill the lust of their hearts, to dishonor their bodies with them. Verse 25, and they changed the truth of Elohim into a lie, and worshipped and served the created things much more than the Creator of them, to whom belong glory and blessing forever and ever. Amen. Skipping down 3 verses to verse 28. And as they did not determine with themselves to know Elohim, well, Elohim gave them over to a vain mind, that they might do what they should not. And that was the Aramaic English New Testament rendering. Indeed, this is what Cain and his descendants had to look forward to. And even today, we have generations of souls who are imitators of Cain. Oh, these may not have murdered their brothers or sisters, but through their deceptive and desperately wicked hearts, they've bought into the kingdom of darkness, lock, stock, and barrel, where murder of the innocents being the poor, the discarded of society, the unborn, the innocent, is commonplace. These are in their own right wanderers and fugitives in the very lands they claim as their homes. Little do they realize, having their hearts seared and made numb to the truth of the gospel and their desperate need of a Savior, that they will face certain wrath, judgment, and punishment. And certainly wrath and punishment would soon come upon the world of Cain's era, when Yah would bring about a flood to destroy the evil that had overtaken his once Meod Tov, very good creation. And to add to his misery, Cain would never be at peace. Robert Alter renders the passage pertaining to this state, quote, a restless wanderer on the earth, end quote. How many people do we know, or for that matter, how many of us are as Cain here? Restless wanderers on the earth, going through the motions of living Yah's ways, but when Yah or circumstances reveals the heart of these individuals, they are, as Shaul described to Timothy in his second letter to him, to the evangelist, chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. But know this, verse 1, know this, that in the latter days hard times will come. Verse 2, and men will be lovers of themselves and lovers of money, boasters, proud, revilers, unyielding towards their own people. Deniers of grace, wicked, verse 3, unloving, addicted to irreconcilable, malicious gossips, ferocious, haters of the good, verse 4, treacherous, rash, inflated, attached to pleasure more than to the love of Elohim, verse 5, having, and this is the crux of the matter, my friends, having a form of respect for Elohim, but wide from the power of Elohim. Having a form of respect, or in some of the more authorized versions of the Bible, having a form of godliness, but denying the power therein. And he concludes, them who are such repel from. Separate yourself from such individuals. The apostle counsels his young evangelist protege. And that was the Aramaic English New Testament. Does this not fit this situation to a T? Does this not describe this situation to a T? Does this not describe the current situation we're in right now with so many folks experiencing these very things, demonstrating, living out these various things? Wherever Cain would eventually wander in his life, no matter how skilled he'd become at tilling, the soil would remain barren to him and refuse to bring forth its bounty. He and his wife, now wanderers, would no doubt be forced to forage for their food. It would be this act of foraging for their food that Cain would be forced to put his trust in Jehovah to provide him for his sustenance. To provide him his sustenance. For Cain no longer had any means by which to provide for his family, since his skills at tilling were fundamentally taken from him by the cursing of the ground that he would till. You see, humanity is always going to do things Jehovah's way. Ultimately, they're going to do things Jehovah's way, or they're going to do things Jehovah's way. There are no free lunches in life. Ultimately, we're going to, every tongue must confess that Jehovah is all in all. You cannot get around to the fact that he is the source of everything that we need to exist. We cannot do and live on our own. Oh, it may seem to Cain at first that he didn't need Jehovah, as is the thinking of most humans throughout human history. But in the end, it turns out that he would absolutely need Jehovah one way or the other. As an aside, in the ancient book of Jubilees, Jehovah made Cain a fugitive on the earth because of his brother's blood. Again, this focus on blood, the personification of blood, driving this issue and making Cain a fugitive. Verse 13, and Cain said to Jehovah, my punishment is too great to bear. So Cain not only had to contend with the physical penalties of his transgression, but also the guilt that was no doubt seared into his conscience. This punishment, Cain declared, was too great for him to bear. Along that line, the Jasher account goes to great lengths to underscore and bring out the intense grief Cain experienced after he murdered his brother. In that book of Jasher, the text details the interaction Cain has with Jehovah over the incident with Abel. Most interestingly, the writer touches on Jehovah bringing up to Cain a couple of his eternal attributes, which would lend to Jehovah's qualifications to pass and execute judgment on Cain. One, Jehovah is a reader and judge of the heart of man. Two, Jehovah is omniscient. He is all-knowing, he is all-seeing, and he is omnipresent. So you can't pull the wool over Jehovah's eyes. Jehovah, as part of his sentence, his judging against Cain, curses the ground on which Cain would till for his food. So Cain could no longer be a tiller, but a wanderer, or better, a forager. Verse 14. Still in chapter 4 of Genesis. Now that you have driven me from this day from the soil. Notice Cain's focus. You've not driven. He's being driven from the soil, at least in Alter's translation. But in Alter's translation, Cain says, you've driven me this day from the soil, and therefore I must hide from your presence. And so I shall be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me. There's a sense here that Cain, prior to his murdering his brother, found great comfort and peace in being in the presence of Jehovah when he dwelt in his father's home or in his dwelling in Eden. And there's a sense that his banishment would remove the protections he enjoyed living in that presence. That protection, Cain noted, would be effectively removed as a result of his banishment. This situation is referred to in rabbinic circles as a forfeiture of divine protection. A forfeiture of divine protection. This spiritual reality is realized when Jehovah declaring that he would hide his face from Yisrael in the day the people would arise and play the harlot with the strange gods of the land, into the midst of which they were going, forsaking Jehovah and breaking the covenant he had made with them. Deuteronomy chapter 31, verses 16 through 18. This was Yisrael forfeiting divine protection. They're delving into paganism and playing the harlot, forfeiting divine protection. This is a reality that we all must be diligent to avoid at all costs, especially in these perilous times when we turn our hearts away from Jehovah our Elohim. We run the risk of losing or forfeiting the divine protection he places over us. So we must always be vigilant to guard our hearts, and we do that most effectively when we willingly endeavor to die to self. So Cain somehow had the foresight to be concerned for his safety. He feared being killed by an avenger of blood that the Torah talks about in Numbers chapter 35. This part of the story paints for us a shadow picture of Jehovah making provisions, though, for the manslayer. In essence, Cain was crying out to Jehovah for a place or means of refuge to escape potential avengers of Abel. Now, where would he, the third human to come into existence, learn or know about murder? How would he come to know about vengeance, divine protection, and such things? These are rather advanced concepts that were somehow planted in the mind of Cain, especially given that there were, at the time, just 2 other souls alive on the planet. But somehow Cain realized that there would come a time in the future when the population of the world would be such that men would take up causes such as vengeance and come after him. Clearly, this would be something to happen only in the distant future, though. It's interesting, very interesting to me how these things were understood by this very early human. Verse 15, and Jehovah said to him, therefore, whoever kills Cain shall suffer 7-fold vengeance. And Jehovah set a mark upon Cain so that whoever found him would not slay him. Now, the mark that was rendered unto Cain by Jehovah was more that of a mark of protection than that of a stigma that Cain would be resigned to carry upon his body till he died. Many over the centuries have sought to spiritualize this mark, but sometimes that which is foreign to our modern day Western sensibilities are best left to its natural understanding. It's a mark that was placed upon Cain to identify him as a protected person. It was a protective device. The establishment of the mark upon Cain that would warn any who would seek to avenge the murder of Abel, it served to strike fear in the hearts of men that they themselves would receive a far greater set of punishments from Jehovah than was meted out to Cain if they succeeded in killing Cain. Now, some rabbinic circles say that Cain was a repentant sinner, and thus he was afforded by Yah the mercy he received in the form of this mark. But this to me is pure prairie gibberish at best. Nothing in this text suggests that Cain repented of his transgression. Now, as I've always asserted, if the text is silent on a matter, does that silence say a thing one way or another? No, it doesn't. And I will concede that silence in biblical text leave room for contemplation and discussion, but certainly it is all ill-advised for us to take advantage of the silence in order to put forth a doctrine that cannot be proved. Because it can be misleading and it can create confusion. So it's best at times to allow the text to speak for itself. And if it's silent, it's silent. There's nothing wrong with speculating, but when we go to the lengths of making doctrine out of something that comes out of silence, then we got problems. Verse 16, and Cain went out from Jehovah's presence and dwelled in the land of Nod east of Eden. Let's stop here. Interestingly, the Hebraic cognate with Nod. In cognate, we mean that is a term of interest having an attached meaning. The cognate with Nod here is the term used for wanderer from verse 12 of our passage. Nod, meaning wanderer? Is it a coincidence or an intentional situation here? Just thoughts and reflections, my friends. Now, Hertz interprets Cain's removal from the presence of Jehovah as evidence that Eden was a special place. As I've mentioned in our last Torah reading discussion entitled, Who is to Blame for the Sins of the World, Adam or Eve? I believe Eden, especially the garden located within Eden proper, was an exclusive extension of Jehovah's kingdom here on earth. For I've always held that wherever Jehovah dwells, there we find his kingdom. And so if Jehovah's Spirit, his Ruach, dwells within us, we can rest assured that the kingdom of Jehovah is in us, as our master taught in Luke chapter 17, verse 21. Now, Josephus, who I would describe as an estranged rabbi, contends here that Cain slew his brother in response to Jehovah viewing Cain's offering as an invention of a covetous man. An invention of a covetous man that was, quote, gotten by forcing the ground. Abel's offering, conversely, came from naturally of its own accord. In other words, some Josephus believed that Cain's offering or his worship was rejected because he offered produce as opposed to animal, as an offering, as a sacrifice. And he goes into this bizarre thing that Abel's offering came from naturally of its own accord. In other words, it was a natural thing, but Cain's offering was brought about because of man's work, his effort. Whereas Abel's offering sheep or goat, whatever he offered, came because it was naturally alive. It was natural. It's a weird way of thinking that is interesting to me, but at times you wonder, it's a bit of a stretch. You really have to be a deep thinker to come through with that. But there's nothing wrong with contemplating these things. It's just when people make these assertions that they hold to be true and that your followers are to adhere to these thinkings, then it becomes a problem. In this case, we're talking about Josephus, who was a historian, and I don't think it's too much of a risk, but when you're talking about a rabbi who's putting this out to his followers, then it can become problematic. But we're just talking stuff here, aren't we? We're just looking at some of the thinking, how this was all thought out, at least in the first century. We find in 1 John, though, chapter 3, verse 12, Yochanan, John provides a counter-explanation to Josephus' rabbinic thinking for Cain's murder of Abel. John writes, Cain, who was of that wicked one, and slew his brother. So here John assigns Cain to the enemy, the wicked one. And John continues, and therefore slew he him, because his own works were evil and his brother's righteousness. So there was a battle between righteousness and evil. And of course, the enemy was involved. Yochanan contrasts Abel's sense of righteousness to Cain's sense of evil. And it was evil, it's lasciviousness, it's iniquity that drove Cain to murder his brother, more so an iniquitous spirit and heart. I can't argue with that. That makes total sense. Josephus's text takes an interesting turn by quoting Jehovah in the midst of his questioning Cain's evil act as, I wonder at thee. Now, this is again the stretch that is Josephus. He surmises that the father says to Cain, I wonder, get a hold of this. I wonder at thee that thou knowest. This is Elizabethan. Let me try to translate it in more modern parlance. I wonder at you is what he's saying, that you know not what is become of the man whom you yourself have destroyed. I really wonder about you. You say you killed this man, but you don't know anything about him. You don't know where he is. It's more of a statement by Jehovah regarding Cain's evil intent and actions, is it not? It wasn't that father was wondering about why or what. He's a searcher of the heart. He knows what was in Cain's heart. But it's interesting. And it is because of this conundrum, according to Josephus, that Jehovah did not carry out the death penalty against Cain, but instead condemned him to be accursed in the earth, a fugitive. And the text states that Jehovah cast Cain out of the land along with his unnamed wife. Now, according to the book of Jasher, as was mentioned in Genesis, it stresses that Cain, quote, went out from the presence of Jehovah, from the place where he was, end quote. And so Cain dwelled in the land toward the east of Eden, he and all belonging to him. Let's move on to verse 17. And Cain knew his wife, and she conceived and bore Enoch. Then he became the builder of a city and called the name of the city like his son's name, Enoch. Hers cast doubt as to the physical identity of Cain's wife, citing that incest is abhorrent to the Jew and that it violates Jehovah's Torah. Leviticus chapter 28, verse 9. Indeed, incest is prohibited in Torah. But it would seem that Jehovah permitted what we know today as incest to take place in the early stages of human history in order to establish the human population. And later on, as the number of humans grew in the earth, Jehovah prohibited the practice. Now, if we believe the biblical narrative to be true, that the first humans to ever exist were Adam and Eve, there were no others, then there is no other conceivable answer to this conundrum. Cain had to have married his sister. I said it, yes. The extra-biblical text of Jasher and Jubilees both affirm this understanding that Cain married his sister. You know, this is one of those instances I would assert where the Bible's silence on an issue can easily be understood, as there is no other explanation. Now, some have postulated the extra-biblical thinking that Jehovah created another set or sets of humans apart from Adam and Eve. People have actually come up with this stuff, that there were other sets of humans that the Bible just doesn't mention. Now, our Bibles and the extra biblical writings don't support that contention. Our Bibles do not suggest that there were other humans created by the Father. or that they just somehow spontaneously came out of nowhere. And so they were out there, and Cain and Seth had accessible wives that were not their sisters. Now, our Bibles, nor do any of the extra biblical, as bad as some of the extra biblical resources may be to us, none of them support such contention. Now, I get how hard it must be for some to swallow the fact that Cain and Seth both married their sisters, but that's because we have a healthy bias against incest. But we must recognize that Jehovah often works within the framework of what he has in place on the earth at the time in human history in order to fulfill his will on the earth. This same principle is seen in the practice of polygamy. Jehovah established marriage to be between one man and one woman. However, he permitted polygamy to be practiced by his people for a defined period of time in human history. Now, at the end of the day, we can rest assured that the Creator knows what he's doing. And Jehovah commanded the first couple and their progeny, their descendants, to be fruitful and multiply. So why would Father give a commandment without the means by which to fulfill that commandment? This is just food for thought, my friends. According to Josephus in his Antiquity of the Jews, he attributes Cain with the proliferation of evil in the world at that time. The violent accumulation of personal wealth, which he encouraged his acquaintances to do likewise, making him a great, albeit wicked, leader of wicked men in the earth at that time. He was an inventor of weights and measures, and it was on account of this that Cain was able to coax the world into what Josephus states, quote, into cunning craftiness, end quote. And it was also from this that he established fortified walled cities. We spoke about this earlier. Now, the ancient book of Jubilees, there's a question that comes. Where did Cain get his wife from? And Genesis speaks about Cain knowing his wife and the two rearing children. But according to the text, a second daughter was born unto Adam and Eve, and she was named Azurah. Now, the first one was Awan, according to the Jubilees text. And Cain took his sister Awan to wife, while Chava, or Eve, gave birth to 9 more sons, according to the text. And Seth ends up marrying his sister, Azurah, according to the Jubilee text. So let me repeat that because it got kind of convoluted there. So the book of Jubilees asserts that Cain took to wife his sister, Awan, while Seth took to wife his sister, Azurah. Now, people of faith have severe difficulty buying into the fact that Cain and Seth married their sisters. I recognize this, and I get it. But that's what we have here. And again, we take these extra biblical references for what they're worth. Obviously, at least in this point, I can say that there's not much you can really say against the Jasher account, because indeed Cain and Seth had to have married their sister, and we'll leave it at that. I think we beat that dead horse to a pulp. Let's go on to skip down from where we were, and for the sake of time, because we are going long again, remove from verse 18, skip 18 through verse 24, and we come to verse 25 that I want to briefly touch upon. And 25 says, and Adam again knew his wife, and she bore a son and called his name Seth, as to say, Elohim has granted me other seed in place of Abel, for Cain has killed him. So we see here that Adam and Eve lost two sons the day that Cain murdered Abel. Abel dies, but Cain is punished by being what's the best word? Banished from Eden, banished from his daddy's home, and becomes a wanderer, a fugitive in the world. And so when they bear Seth, Adam referred to him as a second seed unto them on the earth instead of Abel. And verse 26. As for Seth, to him too a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. It was then that the name of Jehovah was first invoked. And again, Seth takes his sister Azurah to wife according to the ancient book of Jubilee. All right. So what do we have here in terms of practical Messianic halakha? Walking all that we have here, applying it to our walk with Messiah. Jehovah's acceptance of Abel's worship and rejection of Cain's worship here is described from the perspective of him giving regard to Abel and his offering, but to Cain and his offering he did not give regard. The Hebraic terminology used here is fascinating, and when understood, it opens up vistas of spiritual meaning and insight. The Hebrew terms for to give regard is sha'ah. Now, sha'ah means to turn and give one's attention to something. It is obvious that we turn to and give our attention to something that is interesting or important to us. Jehovah would seem to be no different from us here. He obviously found something of interest in Abel's worship that caused him to turn toward Abel and give his offering his undivided attention, which translates into Yah accepting Abel's worship. Conversely, Yah did not turn or give credence to Cain's worship, but instead gave serious examination to Cain's disposition and behavior. If this thing about worship, this concept of worship, is really about the condition of the worshiper's heart. Well, this all makes complete sense and holds tremendous importance to Yah's elect. Because the truth of the matter is that Jehovah recognizes the one with a right heart. And this is stipulated and dwelt upon in passages such as Psalm chapter 34, verse 18, Psalm chapter 51, verse 17, and Isaiah chapter 57, verse 15. Messianic commentator and author Timothy Haig further points out a substantive understanding that Jehovah does not deal with humanity in a capricious way. That is, Yah doesn't just make stuff up to hit humanity over the head with on the fly. And it seems pretty evident from Yah's calling Cain out after he rejects Cain's offering that Cain knew exactly what the problem was with his worship. This is a critical piece of information here that must be understood by Yah's people. When Yah takes issue with us, he is not capricious towards us. We invariably know what the problem is. Well, granted, we may not know precisely at times the nitty-gritty of the problem, but we will invariably have a general sense of what we're doing wrong. That's why it is so important that we constantly seek Yah's leading when we pray, that we ask him to reveal to us those areas in our lives that need fixing so that our covenant relationship with him is not impeded. Now, one of the main reasons we were created was to worship Jehovah. And if our worship is rejected by Jehovah for whatever reason, we by default fail in our created purpose. Matthew chapter 15, verses 8 and 9. And we don't want anything to do with that, do we? That makes for a wasted existence. More so, we must petition the Father to search our heart. as King David described in Psalm chapter 139, verses 23 and 24. Let me read that to you. And the New American Standard Bible reads, "Search me, O Elohim, and know my heart. Try me and know my anxious thoughts, and see if there be any hurtful way in me, and lead me in the everlasting way." You see, one cannot truly be in covenant relationship without inviting Jehovah to conduct a personal heart examination and any needed surgery to keep him or her in right relationship with him, with Jehovah. For many folks within and without our faith community are faking it, and they're going through the motions of serving and walking out their faith, no doubt similar to the life of Cain. These are no doubt having their worship routinely rejected by Abba. But these, instead of confronting the problem headlong and seeking to have their situation corrected through corrective heart surgery, too often choose to turn a blind eye to their spiritual depravity and hope for the best in the end. I've heard it said, it won't be okay. Everything will come out okay in the end. But Yeshua made it clear that he will summarily dismiss such individuals from him and his millennial kingdom, stating that he never knew them. Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. My God, that is indeed an edict none of us should ever want to hear. Yah's grace is extended down to us. As he did with Cain, he's throwing us a lifeline. Through his word and through his spirit. His word points us to Yeshua, Yehoshua, our Messiah, and our need for a Savior. Romans chapter 10, verse 4. The end of Torah is the Messiah. While his Ruach HaKodesh convicts and it corrects us. He corrects us and he convicts us. John chapter 16, verse 8. And when he, the Holy Spirit, comes, he will convict the world concerning sin and concerning righteousness and concerning judgment. Praise Yah. This is, of course, all contingent upon us allowing these divine resources, the Word and the Spirit, when we allow them access to our hearts and our walk, Jehovah's powerful grace to work on our behalf. One of the fundamental themes of this Torah reading has to do with true Jehovah honoring worship. What is true Jehovah honoring worship? I'm talking about the worship that gets Abba's attention, worship that touches the Creator's heart such that he turns towards our offerings, our worship, and he accepts it with pleasure. Today, worship is all about a church's or a fellowship's praise and worship offerings, with some churches producing each Sunday concert level performances to this end. And in these cases, it's more about performance and eliciting some emotional responses from the group's attendees. And from the attendees' perspective, it's often all about the experience. Oh, it was great praise and worship, wasn't it, brother? I love that church's praise and worship. They only go, some people ain't even go to a fellowship or a church because of the praise and worship, the music. People want escapism. People want happiness. People want excitement. People want community. They want togetherness. They want to have a spiritual experience, a spiritual high. That to them is worship. But the tragedy is it's all about them. It's all about the attendee. It's all about self. When worship is supposed to be about him and him alone. You know, years ago, before all the gospel and praise and worship performances took center stage in denominationalism, worship was simpler. It involved the church attendees participating, such as in the singing of hymns and the recitation of prayers. It was up to the attendee to involve themselves in the worship activity, as opposed to what it has become today, that of being an entertainment type of activity, at least in most cases, not in every case. But true biblical worship is an abandonment of self and a full surrendering to the sovereignty, the holiness, the majesty of the creator of the universe. It is, in fact, a true acknowledgement of this reality. Back in the day of the patriarchs, true worship involved solemn acts of reverence in the form of prostrating oneself before Elohim and offering sacrifices, reciting and expressing reverence of Elohim in the form of psalms and prayers. The focus was entirely on the greatness of Jehovah, being thankful for his provision and safety, seeking forgiveness of one's transgressions, and pledging one's allegiance to the Creator and his way of life. The writer of Psalm chapter 95, verse 6 wrote, "Come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before Jehovah our Maker." Worship was a display of one's bending their will to the will of Jehovah. I would invite you to listen to our to read our post on this subject of worship, as I entitled, "Where Do You Worship Jehovah?" if you're interested in finding out more about biblical worship, what true biblical worship is. But over time, worship has devolved into rote mechanical halakha that is devoid of a worshiper's heart bending to the will of the eternal. I'm going to worship him the way I feel like worshiping. Father exclaimed that he was not accepting and appreciative of such contrived efforts at worship of him. Indeed, Jehovah required of his people to worship him in the exacting way he prescribed back in the day. But the worship he prescribed for his people to perform meant absolutely nothing if his people's hearts were not properly circumcised. Of this, the writer declared in Psalm chapter 51, verses 16 and 17, "For you do not delight in sacrifice, otherwise I would give it. You are not pleased with burnt offerings. A broken and a contrite heart, O Elohim, you will not despise." Abba stated through his prophet Hosea, "For I delight in loyalty rather than sacrifice, and in knowledge of Elohim rather than burnt offerings." Hosea chapter 6, verse 6. So as far as Abba is concerned, worship of him is not about rote mechanical Torah keeping, although keeping Torah is extremely important. For Abba, worship of him is about bending our will to his. It's about loving him and loving our neighbor. It's about dying to self and imaging him in the earth. Our master, Yehoshua Messiah, informed the Samaritan woman at Yaakov's well, at Jacob's well, when the woman pressed him as to where Yah's people must worship him. That rote mechanical keeping of Torah was at the forefront of the ancients' minds. That the time was imminent when the people of Elohim would worship Jehovah in spirit and in truth. The worship of a child of Yah that is in spirit is essentially him or her being led by Father's Ruach HaKodesh in their reverencing and serving of Jehovah. The worship of a child of Yah that is in truth is essentially him or her walking out their faith, in their obedience of faith, in their being in true covenant relationship with Jehovah. And in so doing, the elect's day-to-day walk in Messiah becomes that of perpetual worship unto Jehovah. Imagine that your day-to-day walk becomes worship. What a concept that the church triumphant does not teach. Both elements of worship spirit and in truth require that an elect's heart be circumcised pursuant to Jehovah's instructions in righteousness, as rendered in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verse 6, and Jeremiah chapter 4, verse 4. The Apostle Shaul expounded and expanded upon this critical aspect and element of the elect's walk in Messiah when he wrote to the Roman Messianics, and this is chapter 2, verses 28 and 29. And the Aramaic English New Testament reads, "For he is not a Jew who is so in what is external or alone, nor is that only physical circumcision, which is visible in the flesh, but he is a Jew who is so in what is hidden. And circumcision is that of the heart, in the spirit, and not in the letter, whose praise is not from men, but from Elohim." You see, without a circumcised heart, one's worship of the eternal becomes more about us, about him or her, than it is about Jehovah. How so? Because again, the uncircumcised heart of humanity is deceptive and desperately wicked. It is diametrically opposed to the ways of the Almighty. Jeremiah chapter 17, verse 9, and Isaiah chapter 55, verse 8. But when we enter into an obedient covenant relationship with Jehovah, his Ruach HaKodesh takes our heart, even our will, and chips away the stony layers of it to expose the naked flesh therein, whereby he may then inscribe his Torah upon that fleshly table of the surrendered soul's heart. Jeremiah chapter 31, verse 31, and Hebrews chapter 8, verse 6 through 13. I believe Yah rejected Cain's offering because Cain's heart was not right. Cain quite conceivably possessed a rebellious heart and disposition that somehow resisted the Creator's will and even purpose. It no doubt put him at odds with the Creator. Now, a great many contend that Cain's offering was rejected by Jehovah because he failed to render a blood sacrifice unto Jehovah. He instead rendered unto Jehovah the fruits of his tilling labors. Now, I don't know whether or not this is true. It's possible. As I mentioned earlier, Yah does not reveal clearly the reason why he rejected Cain's offering in our text. I'm not talking about the extra biblical text. I'm talking about our Genesis text. That's the one we focus on and believe. But all I know is that Cain's heart was not right, and Abba knew it, as he called Cain out about it before Cain committed the murder. I don't believe the issue here is about the form in which the sacrifice took. I believe it has to do with the state of the worshiper's heart, with the state of Cain's heart, with the state of Abel's heart, that it was accepted. Abel's heart was apparently right before Jehovah, while Cain's heart was not. And the simple fact that Cain would carry out that which he did, the murdering of his brother, is evident enough. It was evidence enough for me that he had a heart problem, and it should be for anybody else. We can learn from the example of Cain even today. For I submit to you that we cannot truly worship our Elohim and expect him to accept our worship and praise if our hearts are not right. Scripture tells us that Yah turns his undivided attention to those who possess a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. Again, Psalm 34, verse 18, Psalm 51, verse 17, Isaiah chapter 66, verse 2. And if you haven't already done so, I invite you to listen to our read our post entitled "A Broken Heart and Contrite Spirit Gets God's Attention," star 67, in order to gain a more in-depth understanding of the relationship that exists between the state of one's heart and their relationship with Jehovah. Beloved, and I'm in closing, if we truly seek to have our worship and our spiritual offerings accepted by Yah, we must endeavor to get our hearts right with the eternal. And it begins with our dying to self and surrendering fully to his will. And so we, in effect, must bring our hearts to him so that he can inscribe his Torah on it. And if we are successful in doing that, Yah will take care of the rest. And before we know it, our worship of Jehovah will be where it's supposed to be, because our worship will be led by the Ruach HaKodesh, and our walk will reflect our covenant relationship with Jehovah, such that we image him in all the earth. Shabbat Shalom, fellow saints in training. Until next time, may you be most blessed. Take care, and we'll be back, Abba willing, with another Sabbath Thoughts and Reflections. We're also still coming forth with the next Paul and Hebrew Roots installment. I would encourage you and invite you to await that dropping sometime here in the next couple or 3 days. Until then, be blessed.